Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Harvey.
Great. Thank you, Dawn. I appreciate it. Folks, thank you for joining us for this third webinar in a series of 5 that are being brought to you by Penn State University and the College of Education's Workforce Development Program, along with NTACT and also ACTE. Today's webinar is obviously the 16th of October, and it's our third webinar, and we're going to be talking about classroom supports, specifically looking at universal design for learning and differentiated instruction, both topics that are mentioned in ESSA and in IDEA and also in the new Perkins V legislation. So I think we have a good webinar series for you today. Next. The agenda is pretty straightforward. Dawn went over the ground rules, but I want to just reiterate with folks that if you have technical difficulties at any point along the way, please go to the chat and type those in, and the NTACT staff will be able to help you with that. Also, if you have questions as you see content or information coming your way that you'd like to explore in the Q&A section at the end, please type those in, because as moderators, we'll come back and revisit those. Have a minute to introduce the panel members here in just a moment, but I want to talk about our last seminar, Seminar 2, which took a look at relationships and professional practices between CTE and special education. I think it's important for this webinar to just reiterate what happened in that webinar series. And really the crux of that webinar series was to talk about having special educators work with CTE professionals and vice versa. As we start to drill down and look at strategies and instructional approaches that work in classrooms, it's equally important that CTE instructors and support staff work with their special ed counterparts from sending schools or school corporations where we have shared students. So just want to reiterate that it's important to make sure that CTE and special educative professionals are working together with that. With this particular webinar series, we're going to explore background and principles of universal design for learning and have a unique perspective from CAST, and Dr. Tracy Hall will be working with us on this. Dr. Hall is a senior research scientist and also an instructional designer for CAST. Additionally, we have UDL in practice perspective from one particular schools district in Indiana, where they actually are both walking the walk and talking the talk, and that's Bartholomew Consolidated School Corporation. Dr. George Van Horn is their Director of Special Education, and he's with us as a speaker as well on this panel. From there, we move forward with taking a look at the background and principles of universal design for learning and specific approaches that are used with differentiated instruction. When we think about DI, it's an important aspect to teaching and learning. We have Dr. Claudia Otto, who is a clinical assistant professor at Oklahoma State University in Tulsa, that is going to be presenting information, and Dr. Otto is part of the special education department at OSU. And finally, last but not least, we really are fortunate to have one of the premier CTE teacher educators in the country working with us on teacher and learning in relationship to CTE settings, looking at both UDL and differentiated instruction. And that individual that's working with us is Dr. Mary Jo Self. She is an associate professor of career and technical education in the educational leadership department at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater. After we're done with the speakers, we'll have an opportunity to engage with you on question and answer. So we'll take time to provide that information, and then we'll move into a wrap up. And so with that, and without further ado, I'd like to have Tracy take over. Thanks.
Well, I'm happy to take over. Thank you, Mike. And I want to thank you at Penn State University, as well as ATC and NTACT, for inviting me to be here and be a part of this panel today. So as Mike said, I'm from the organization called CAST, and I'm a senior research scientist, which means that I get to play and do a lot of work with universal design for learning and see how it impacts teachers and students, which is really our mission and our goal, is to really work with and support what's going on in the classroom so that we have education for all students. Next. I'd like you to all think now. You don't need to raise your hands because none of us can see you, but I'd like you to think now about what's your knowledge of universal design for learning? You know, are you a 1? Are you just in your infancy and learning about universal design for learning? Or do you think you know everything that there is to know about UDL? And if that's the case, you're a big old 5. So just think about that for a moment and we'll move on to the next slide. I'd like to talk about learning diversity and variability. It's huge in our world. And I'll start with a little bit of a story with which, yeah, you're right, move to the next slide, please, thank you, which we call the myth of average. One of my colleagues, Todd Rose, was looking up at some of the research from the Air Force. What they were wanting to do is to design a fighter pilot jet cockpit that would fit all users. And in doing so, they went through many, many failures. The reasons that they went through failures is that there is no average. To fit all would be that we were looking for the average. And in our world, there is no average. We have the mathematical average, but when you look at people, we have great diversity. So they initially started with many failures in being able to get these fighter pilots and their jets off with great success. But when they got over this fact that there really is no average in humans, they were able to then successfully make adjustments and try to look at the ways and the range of ways in which that tool needed to be used. Next slide, please. So that myth of average has lived with us for a long, long time, but if you think about you and your colleagues and people that you know, there really is no average. We all have highs and we all have lows, depending on what it is that we're measuring or looking at when it comes to our size, our height, our weight, and so forth. Let's take that over and to the next slide and think about that in relation to us as people. Can you imagine coming to this webinar and there was a pile of clothing or a nicely folded clothing for you to put on and wear for the day? And take a look at that. For the women on the left-hand side there and the men on the right-hand side there, there's your clothing for the day. Next slide, please. Now, when I've asked people to imagine that in the past, I usually get some pretty interesting comments like, well, I wouldn't be coming out in public because those clothes would not fit. Imagine though, if that were the case. Those are the average clothing sizes. Imagine that you had to wear those. Imagine that you could not take them off. Planning for average is just not going to work effectively. Let's turn, please. So let's think about education. Students, learners vary also on that dimension of learning, which means they have a jagged learning profile, just like size of clothing. There is no average. For some of us, a strength in one area may be a weakness in another area, and depending on those environmental demands on us, that's going to vary incredibly. So we can't nurture individual potential when we're trying to teach to or trying to work toward that average. Next, please. So that's why we call it jagged learning profiles. In the same way that we're not all the same, or there is no average in how we look and our weight and our size and our height and our preferences, the same is true when it comes to our educational skills and challenges cognitively and physically. Next, please. So what we want to think about in thinking about universal design for learning and thinking about our planning and working for instruction is that we really do, in all of our thinking, want to have equality. We want to be able to get the same education to all learners. And if you take a look at the picture on the far left-hand side, that's really looking towards equality. All of those young people trying to watch that baseball game have the same support to be able to access that game. But is that really equality? Is that working? No, because there are different profiles there. There are different learners there. So then we try to have a little bit more equity, right? We can manipulate those supports. And in fact, the youngster on the far left-hand side can see over that fence without needing the box. So if he gives the box to the shorter person there, then all 3 of those viewers can see the game. Next, please. But what we really want to think about is what I'm going to refer to as liberation. In other words, the barrier that was requiring those supports gets removed. We can all see the game, we all have equal access, we can enjoy it and play through it. Next, please. So this is what we think of when we think of universal design for learning. We really are trying to have that liberation to remove what barriers we can. But in those cases when barriers cannot be removed, we want to look at supports and scaffolds that can support the learners and get us all to learning. The basis of universal design for learning comes from some work by Ron Mace, an architect. And he brought into the world of architecture that notion of universal access. This picture on the left-hand side is a picture from the Louvre, the entryway to the Louvre, that pyramid. So cool looking, very beautiful design. There's an elegant staircase that moves from the entryway into the upper levels of the Louvre. And that stairwell is absolutely beautiful, and many users get to where they need to go. But think about what barriers there could be in a staircase. We may have experienced them ourselves. If there's no elevator or no other access point, other people may not be able to access all of that beautiful artwork and things you can do in the Louvre. But if you take a look closely at the bottom of the staircase, there's a little casing down there, and that is actually an elevator. And that elevator goes straight up the center of that stairwell. All users have a choice as to which way they can get to the top and access all the beautiful artwork in the Louvre. They will get to the same place by accessing either the staircase or using the elevator. And that's what we want to think about. Good for all. How can we develop and create our architecture that's good for all? And now let's apply that to education and universal design for learning and look at ways in which we can provide access for all. Let's remove the barriers. Let's get all learners to that same space and place. Next, please. So when we think about universal design for learning, I think this is a nice structure to consider. It's a framework to improve and optimize teaching and learning for all people by removing barriers in the curriculum. Next, please. Universal design for learning was really inspired by three fields. The first field is architecture, which we talked about a moment ago. And here's another illustration on the left-hand side of a staircase, moving from one space, moving people from a lower space to an upper space, or the reverse. But there's also a ramp built right into it, a very elegant design, pleasant to the eyes, but it meets the objective of people wanting to move to get to the same space without difficulty. Next, please. The second slide shows the second field, which is the neurosciences. And a lot of the work that's been happening with all of the advances in technologies, with MRIs and fMRIs and so forth, has really helped us to understand the brain in much better ways. We're not going to go into a neuroscience lecture by any means, but what I want to show you is that there is no average brain. We could have two users that can read at the same reading level, read a word, and different neurons would fire in their brain. There may be some similarities, but there would be differences too. And as you multiply and do fMRIs on more people, you would see the same thing. There is no average. We're not all doing this in the same way. Next, please. Then the third inspiration is really technology. Technology is a wonderful thing, although sometimes we all get a little frustrated by it. But technology helps us in thinking about access and supports and scaffolds for all to be very, very flexible means by which we can accomplish that. Universal design for learning can be done, certainly without high levels of technology, but the technology of the digital environment is so nice and flexible, it really is a great access point to help make those barriers disappear and for us to provide education for all learners. Next, please. So from that inspiration of those three different areas, we really created three basic principles of universal design for learning. The why of learning, the what of learning, and the how of learning. And there are these three principles from which we then work and develop the universal design for learning guidelines and principles to help people to apply and make use of universal design for learning. How do learners get engaged through the affective networks, that whole system that really helps us to engage and maintain attention throughout the learning process, or throughout whatever process we might be engaged in. Maybe that baseball game we were looking at a little while ago. There's the recognition network, and this is the what of learning. This is how we get information. Often in the educational setting, in schools, the teacher is telling us information. or we read information out of a text. There are other ways in which we can get that network active, and what it is that we're learning can be presented in a range of ways, and that's what we want to think about when we think about recognition. Finally, the strategic network, that how of learning, is really what we'll refer to as action and expression. How can we, as educators, learn what our students have learned? In other words, how are they demonstrating knowledge? What are the ways in which we can ask students to demonstrate their understanding of what it is that they're learning? So those are the three basic principles of universal design for learning, and we're really working at this basic level today. Next slide, please. I highly recommend that you take a look at this video, and you're going to get the link to that video. This is a wonderful video by Shelley Moore, who's out of the British Columbia area, and she makes a great analogy between this notion of bowling and the challenge of hitting a 7-10 split and education. And the story goes such that when we throw, us non-professional bowlers throw a bowling ball, many often go straight down the alley and try to hit that head pin so that you can knock down. And what usually happens is we get that 7-10 split. Those are the learners on each end of the spectrum, those who are super challenged and those who are not getting challenged enough. And we want to be able to knock down more of those pins. In other words, provide our education to meet the needs of all learners for whom we're working. I really suggest that you connect into that video that Shelley has created. It's very nice. Next slide, please.
And just to let the audience know, in your PowerPoint, the one that you downloaded, the link is available so that you can watch this after the fact. Thank you.
Thanks. It's a really nice YouTube video. It's about 3 minutes long, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. I want to conclude right now by just sharing with you some UDL assumptions, Universal Design for Learning assumptions. Learning is dynamic, and that's that interaction of the individual with the environment and the context. So in some areas, I might be challenged because of the environmental demands. In other areas, I may not be challenged because of the different kinds of demands on me at that moment. I'm kind of short, so when the environment requires for me to reach up high and do something, it's a challenge for me. And the same thing can be true in terms of thinking of different kinds of particular skill areas in our instruction. Second assumption is that learner ability or disability is an intersection of that individual with their environmental context. We change that environmental context. What are the barriers that are there for students? How can we think about removing those barriers? And learners, students, in any learning environment represent a range of variability that, again, there is no average. And of course, our goal is always to develop expert learners, students who will be learning forever, as we all are. Thank you.
Hi, this is George Van Horn. I just wanted to do a little follow-up on some of the information Tracy provided. She gave us a real good solid background of universal design for learning. And I think the one thing that you probably should grab onto is that variability is the norm, that there is no average. In our school district, Bartholomew Consolidated School Corporation, we actually started working with CAST I'm going to say around 2002, and we have been together and partnering ever since. And as I always like to say when I speak about UDL is everything we've know and learned about UDL is because of our relationship with CAST and their willingness to work with us, support us, and share information with us. What started out as what we thought was going to be a fairly simple thing really became, as the title says, what a long, strange trip it's been. It's been very strange. And on certain days, it feels very long. And for those of you who are not Grateful Dead fans, that's where the What a Long, Strange Trip It's Been comes from, is the song Truckin' by the Grateful Dead. And it really has, that really is a good descriptor for where we started, where we are, and where we're going. So, and on the next slide, you can see just a little bit about our school district. We are in Columbus, Indiana. We're about 45 miles south of Indianapolis. Just a little tourist attraction. We are 6th in the country. We are known for our architectural significance, 6th in the country. So if you need a place to visit, come to visit Columbus. And if you're here, get a hold of us and you can come and spend some time in our schools. We do have some diversity within our school corporation. We are at about 50%, maybe 48% students who are on free and reduced lunch. We do have about 11 to 13% English language learners, and we have approximately 64 different languages that are spoken in our schools. We have people from all over the world who are here. For those of you who don't know, Columbus is the home of Cummins. It's an engine company. Their world headquarters is here, and they are a Fortune 200 company that employ about 50,000 people globally. So we have lots of different folks who are here. We also are at about 13% of our students have IEPs, and that's an important percent because that is down several percentage points from going back to 2002, and that becomes a factor later on that I'll talk about, is our reduction in students who required IEPs and being evaluated for disabilities. So that's just a little bit of a piece of our district. So the next thing I want to talk about is the why. And Tracy talked about the why, the what, and the how. And in our district, everything we do starts with the why. Because if people don't understand why you're doing something, then they're probably not going to get on board and they're not going to be very interested. So our why started with a goal, which is pictured on the next slide. And what it shows is on the left, or my left, is a traditional classroom, which I must say we still have some. We are by no means the 100% utopian universal design for learning school district, but we have been working on this a long time and we have made a lot of progress. And our goal was to really have all our learning environments look like the one on the right. And what I like about that picture, and by the way, the one on the left's not actually a picture of one of our classrooms. The one on the right is a picture from one of our elementary schools. And what you see in that picture are students working in groups. There's 3 students working together. You have a couple of students working independently. You have another pair of students working. And what I like most about this is there's a computer in the middle of the page, or in the middle of the picture, and nobody's utilizing that computer. And what I like about that is many people confuse UDL with technology, and that you have to have technology, and if you don't have technology, you can't use UDL to create learning environments. That's not true. Now, technology is a tool to remove barriers and create options for students is very helpful, but they are 2 separate things. And in UDL, technology is a tool. So on the next slide, this was probably our big aha moment in our school corporation. We were pretty good. Our students were showing some growth on our state assessment, but nothing like to get excited about. And we couldn't figure out why we weren't doing a better job. And what we came to the conclusion was everybody was working really hard. We were using really good quality interventions and instructional strategies. And, you know, we were doing a lot of inclusive services and things like that. But what we determined was everybody was kind of doing their own thing, and we had a lot of random acts of improvement. And some people hear random acts of improvement and think that's a negative. That's not a negative, that's a positive. In fact, if you think about public education, we're all about random acts of improvement. You know, this program is going to fix this, and this program is going to do that, and take the bubble wrap off of this, and it's going to fix that. And what we found was that because we didn't have one big arrow guiding where we were going, all of our hard work really was random. And so we tried to think about how do we bring this together, and that led us to the what, which is the next slide, and thinking of what can we do that'll tie us all together. And we came up with universal design for learning. We didn't come up with universal design for learning. We learned about universal design for learning. And I think this is how what we believe about UDL is best depicted on the next slide, which is something one of our teachers wrote on a whiteboard at one of our trainings. And she said that UDL is not a diet, it's a lifestyle change. And if you stop and think about education, it's a diet. Because again, we try new programs, we try different things, and we have fads. And we like to joke, if you've been in education for a long time, a lot of people have the mindset of, if I keep my head down, this too shall pass, and the next thing will come along. So, and that's a lot how diet works. So we really thought about, we have to have a lifestyle change. We have to start thinking differently and start acting differently. And on the next slide, there's a quote from CAST, and it really helped get us together. So now in our school district, our UDL is not a district initiative. It's the framework that drives everything. And if you think about a framework, what we started to do was anything new that we wanted to try or anything new that we were going to do, the first question was, how does this support our utilization of UDL as a framework? And how does this help us implement and use the 3 principles and the 9 guidelines of UDL in creating all our learning environments? If the answer was we don't know, then we didn't do it, which really changed our thinking about, well, this grant's available, let's just go there because we need money. It became, how's that going to help us? How's that going to do this? And I have a colleague who's a professor at the University of Indianapolis, and he asked his class a question one time, and he said, raise your hand if you can tell me what the framework in your school district is for curriculum and instruction. And 2 people raised their hand, and they were both from our district, and they said Universal Design for Learning. But when you think about a school corporate or school district, it's rare that there's one framework that ties all the work together. So that's what the what for us became Universal Design for Learning. So how we did it, going to the next slide, and actually the next slide, was by starting way back in 2002, a little bit after I got here. I started looking at special education and inclusion and didn't feel we were as inclusive as we should have been. So we started looking at regular schools and regular classrooms, and we did this thing we called instructional service delivery, and we started asking questions about how we're making instructional decisions about students with disabilities. And that led to broader conversations, because what we were finding was that we were probably not going to be successfully including students unless we changed the learning environments we were including them in, because they were already there once and they weren't successful. So how did we begin to change those? That's where we came back to Universal Design for Learning and started working with our elementary schools. Several of them were identified as pilot schools by PATNS, which is a statewide project in Indiana. And through PATNS is where I got connected with CAST. Vicki Hirschman was the prior director of that project, and she connected me with CAST and David Rose, and kind of the world took off from there. And we really began looking at our building continuous improvement teams and training them on what the principles of Universal Design for Learning were. And what we did that I think is key to leading this to be our district framework is I became, if you know the Wizard of Oz, the person behind the curtain. Because anytime I spoke, given my title, Director of Special Education, everybody just thought, well, this just applies to special ed. And what we were saying was, no, it applies to all. So our Director of Elementary Ed, Bill Jensen, and our Director of Elementary Ed at the time was Karen Garrity. They started sort of being the front people to talk about this. So the 3 of us worked together. We were all on board and began to work with our building level teams and our district level teams to provide a little bit more knowledge about Universal Design for Learning. And that's what I think made the key for us. The other thing we did was we never forgot that we didn't know everything, and we're always looking for something new. And as we thought we kind of mastered this, we realized we really hadn't. So one of the barriers we had was we needed more supports in schools. Some of you may know the name Louie Lord Nelson. She has written books on Universal Design for Learning and does lots of trainings, and she's wonderful. She was our first district Universal Design for Learning coordinator. And so she helped us, was kind of our feet on the ground in the buildings. What we quickly discovered was one person providing support to 18 buildings wasn't going to work. So we had to think of a way to expand our resources. And on this next slide, what you'll see, and this is our current resource, is that we have 2 district Universal Design for Learning coordinators. We have 9 UDL facilitators. There's a half-time facilitator in each one of our buildings. We also looked at the integration of Universal Design for Learning. Many of you know PBIS as Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports. In our district, we changed the I, and it's Positive Behavior Instructional Supports, because we believe behavior is a skill that needs to be taught, and that intervention is reactive and instruction is proactive. Again, just changing it to meet our common language. And then we also utilize instructional consultation teams, which is something we learned about from Todd Gravois, in terms of how do we provide some shoulder-to-shoulder support for teachers. So all those resources we began to integrate. And the important piece is you're seeing 11 positions, 9 facilitators, 2 coordinators, and going, well, where'd you get that money? I flash you back to our reduction in the number of students who needed special education. As our learning environments of regular ed removed barriers and created more options, more students were being successful and did not need to be referred for special education. So as our numbers in special ed went down, we repurposed many of those positions and those dollars to fund our facilitators and coordinators. So we didn't get new money, we reprioritized current resources and dollars. So we took what we had and put it again in our framework and used where it was. And then a big piece for us was our teacher evaluation. We were able to create our own teacher evaluation system, and it has 4 components. One component is universal design for learning, and that is, the other is PBIS, and another is academic citizenship, which are teachers being on committees and all their professional responsibilities, and then of course student learning outcomes. But the key is 50% of a teacher's evaluation in our district is based on universal design for learning, the principles of universal design for learning, and another 15 on PBIS. So 65% of our teachers' evaluation are based on that framework. So that really helped us move forward. And then I think a slide that sums up everything we think about and believe comes from my favorite basketball coach, Pat Summitt, who was the women's coach at University of Tennessee for many years before she passed away. She said that there are no 2 players who are alike. There's no such thing as average. There's student learner variability. There's no 2 players who are alike. And in schools, we're being asked our students to achieve the same standards. Well, she indicates she asks all her players to achieve the same standards, but she knows she couldn't ask them to get there in the same way, that you had to try different things and create different options. That's exactly what we're trying to do in school and in BCSE. So with that, I'd like to thank you and pass this on to Claudia.
Claudia, you're on mute still. Unmute yourself.
Oh, can everybody hear me now? Sorry about that, everybody. Okay, so I used instructional differentiation when I was a teacher at the high school level, teaching children who were considered ELL, at risk, various disabilities within mild, moderate, severe, and profound. So next slide, please. I'd like to share instructional differentiation with you. So students differ in readiness, interest, learning profile. By readiness, I mean it could be referring to the individual needs of the students, who are students classified as, like I said before, at risk, or who have a learning disability, or who are ELL. So basically think performance level overall and performance level per content, not just their grade level. What is their actual achieving level at this point in time based on, their individual readiness? So speaking a different language, they may understand the content in their language, but in English, it's going to be very different, their performance level. By interest, I mean, do not train children to learn by force or harshness. Low grades do not motivate. So direct them to your content, to the mastery by what amuses their minds, so that you may be better able to discover with accuracy the peculiar bent, is what I like to call it, the peculiar bent of the genius of each of the children. Their learning profile are the ways that they process and organize information, the brain function, the methods that they prefer for learning. I like to think of the learning styles, but not just the learning styles, the multiple intelligences, their interpersonal strengths. So how they receive the instruction, the content is one manner, but again, we have to think about how they process it. How do they swirl it around in their head and classify it? So the presence of learning and behavior concerns is another factor, that the environmental dynamics. Students feel differently at school than they are at home. And at school, they have favorite classrooms, and sometimes that favoritism isn't based on the content, it's based on the feel of the environment, the way the classroom is set up. So I always like to think of it that you know, when they come to your classroom, you want them to feel like your classroom is an extension of their home, something familiar to associate with. Next slide, please. So differentiated instruction, it provides students, you know, with multiple options for learning and for expression of what they've learned. It does not, however, change, you know, what is taught. You're not changing the content, you're not changing the standards, you're simply changing how it's taught. It's the goal of matching, you know, my teaching to my students' learning, to find a nice fusing of the both. It's proactive, it's more qualitative than quantitative. So we need that quantitative, we need the grades, I understand that. But however, we also want that story. They need to see the story, the reality, the association of it. It's very organic and dynamic. So remember, you know, for example, if you create an instructional piece within this format, then the students are receiving it potentially in various forms. That's the beauty of DI. So I may be offering, you know, I may say something once in class, but if I have structured it and created it within differentiated instruction, then the students are actually receiving it potentially 6 different ways, 6 different structural, you know, presentations. If I offer this one unit or this one piece of information, if I offer it visually, if I offer it kinesthetically, if I offer it auditorily, and if I create it more than just a picture, but picture support. And I'll show you what I mean about that here in a little bit. Next slide, please. So the elements of differentiation, you know, content, process, product, and learning environment. So basically, you know, you're looking at the method, the media of the input of what the students are trying to learn, what you're trying to give them. The process, you're looking more at the practice and the exercise. And this is where, you know, this is your potential of really manipulating and, you know, moving the information and showing them the information in various formats. The product is how the students demonstrate what they have learned. And again, instructional differentiation fits very well with this, and the learning environment, the physical and the psychological conditions for students' optimal learning. So you want to design lessons based on students' learning styles. You want to group the students to shared interest, topic, or ability for the assignments. Individual students want the individual opportunities to practice using their interests, and then they also want to practice, you know, sharing their interests and working collaboratively with their peers. So, you know, if you watch students, they love to share what they learned and how they interpret things, whether it's a birthday gift they received or something they found or something they learned in another class. So the way they love to share that and give their interpretation, that, you know, if you harness that and implement that in the classroom, that's a wonderful way for them to learn. Now you're going to establish some behavior norms with instructional differentiation. So basically you're trying to train the students with, you know, explanation and modeling so that they understand how to use this structure, you know, of your content. You want to build in accountability, and grades to me is not accountability, but it's, you want to build in self-awareness for them so that they see, for example, how they're progressing. So a prompt helps students to know how to begin. For example, you know, if they receive a writing prompt, they know what they're supposed to write about. So what about scaffolding clues and prompts, you know, that will show, that will tell the students, you know, what they've achieved and what one more level they need to achieve, what else they need to add to that already existing knowledge towards mastery. I like to think of it and give the example. It's kind of like video games. When students play video games, you have various levels, and when they finish one level, they know they have to get to another level, but they know what they have to accomplish in level 1 in order to get to level 2. And they feel very successful because they see that, oh, I'm in level 2, and they do the same thing to reach level 3. Well, if you arrange your instruction in that kind of format, you know, where they can see a prompt and they can see this is what will lead to this next step, and step 3 will lead to step 4. It does help them. So when we're assessing students' learning, we want to think about and consider using, you know, the formative and the summative assessments, but fuse them together. I used to teach students with mild, moderate disabilities, and if their primary disability or one of the strong, you know, deficits is reading and writing, and they're taking an English class, then obviously if I grade them simply on their essay, you know, they're not going to do very well. I want to know about the content as well. So if I find another modality for them to regurgitate that information back to me, and I fuse those two products together, I have the grammar of the essay, but I have something, maybe a PowerPoint perhaps, where they can show me what the content truly was that they were trying to tell me. So when I'm grading them, I know I'm not just grading on the grammar, the low writing skills that they potentially may have. So then we need to think about managing the classroom environment to create that safe and supportive environment. Students need to feel that they know where, when, how to proceed, you know, within that environment. And you want to continually assess and reflect to adjust the lesson content that you've created, adjust your structure, because it will meet the students' needs, and that meeting of the students' needs is going to differ depending on the dynamic that you have of students within that class period, or the dynamic that's happening in the environment at that time, you know, from fall to spring to summer, from Monday to Friday, from morning to afternoon. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about content, we want to think about the method, the media of how the information is taught. So for example, problem-based or place-based education, that's immersion with familiarity. I gave you on these next slides various examples to kind of help you get started. So I wrote them in a way where if you type them into the internet, you'll get a lot more information based on them. But I wanted you to have something to start with, because I know we're on limited time here. So anyway, so if you think about curriculum compacting and sequencing, for example, I like to think of it as, for example, the grocery store. You know, when you go to a grocery store, have you ever been in line at the checkout and you see that people will put, you know, the eggs at the end, the bread at the end, they'll put the milk at the first. Why? Because they know that the bread needs to go on top of the shopping cart and the milk needs to go on the bottom, because you don't want flat bread. If you wanted pita, you would have bought pita. So anyway, it's the same kind of thinking. If you go into your closets or your bathroom, I doubt I'm going to find, if I go into your closet or your bathroom, a can of pork and beans and Kraft macaroni and cheese inside your closet where your clothes are, or inside your bathroom cabinet. No, we know that they go in the cabinets in the kitchen, because we categorize, because we label, because we decide to, what I call chunking things together. We compact them, and we have a pattern, we have a sequence. Well, it's the same thing with a curriculum. If you design it, again, with instructional differentiation, if you design it in a compacted format, for example, then the students will learn things based on these smaller chunks. I mean, everything we do in life, realistically, if you think about it, you know, we chunk it somehow. If you recite your social security number, for example, you will typically, people do it in pauses, and you pause where the hyphen, where the dash is. Same thing with phone numbers. We tend to associate things in our life based on chunks. That association is also key, because, for example, if I smell a certain perfume, I always think of my grandmother. If I smell a certain type of cigar smoke, I think of my grandfather, because, you know, that was the perfume she always wore, and he was a cigar smoker. And so I associate, you know, those scents with them. I hear a certain song, and I associate, you know, that sound to my prom, to my wedding, to when my children were born. So if we harness our curriculum and we decide to, for example, chunk it, you know, curriculum compacting, we form a sequence and we tie it to an association, something that's very familiar, then the students, you know, they will be able to grab the information a lot easier. Next slide, please. That brings us to process, practice, and exercises. This is about the learning preference, the interests. You have to think, you know, the processes that are appropriate for, you know, the students' specific needs. So it's not just about visual learners and providing pictures to support, you know, vocabulary, for example. I've seen a lot of teachers, and I used to do this as well, where I would have the vocabulary word and I would have a picture. But then, you know, what do you do with that? That's in isolation. So instructional differentiation, you want to take that a step further within that DI. So taking a step further would be providing the pictures that work together, and you form kind of like a comic strip, for example. So this will allow the students to visually see how the information, how those vocabulary words proceed into a generalized conclusion, for example. So you want to present information and have the students decide what is the pattern that they see, what is the sequence that I'm seeing within there, and then come up with, once they see the pattern and the sequencing, and you have a really good Q&A going on with them, they will decide what the standard is, what the rule is, rather than me telling them. I could tell my students that when I taught English, for example, an independent clause, what it was, or a coordinating conjunction. Well, students, with learning disabilities aren't going to remember those terminologies, but because I taught the class using a color code key, they could tell me, for example, they couldn't tell me an independent clause or dependent clause, but they could tell me, a compound sentence was pink, yellow, pink, or a complex sentence was yellow, pink, green, or green, pink, yellow, because I was able to teach them to chunk it and find the pattern, and they could tell me what the rule was based on the color. Next slide, please. So that brings me to product. This color code key that I was telling you about, for example, that is one way to help students visualize, find patterns, and then how they regurgitate that information, how they demonstrate the knowledge to us is very important, because that is where we will find what other support do we need to bring in, within our content structure. So instead of, traditional assignments and assessments, the written reports and papers, why not, like I said before, fuse things together, graphic organizers and mental pictures. So for example, graphic organizers work great. Whenever we created a graphic organizer, the students would use that as their study guide. Then I would take it one step further to realize what their mastery truly was, to see if there were any holes. And I could tell them, okay, let's color code it based on this. And whatever color was missing, they knew that's the information that was missing from their study guide. They knew what more they had to add to it. It's the same thing when I taught my students how to write, essays. When they wrote them, when we put it in through a program to see the readability, it was probably about second grade readability. But once they used the color code key and they chunked information and they used a lot of these really great strategies and methods that fall within differentiated instruction, they were able to see, and they would tell me, Miss Otto, I am missing blue. Well, now you know what's missing from your essay paper, you know what you need to add. See, it's that visual support that they know. And the pattern, I would ask them, where do you need to add the blue? And they would always tell me, well, the blue comes after the green. So they found that sequence. It was their own standard and their own rule that they came up with. Next slide, please. So environment, that brings us to environment. Conditions of how information is shared. So learning is a very vulnerable aspect, and students need to feel safe that it is okay to give the answer that they want to state, or that even if it's wrong, that there's going to be something accurate in there. Even if the accuracy is that they raise their hand and they tried. So student or teacher-centered instruction, whole, small group, learning stations, ability grouping, learning style grouping. Group students also based on their interests and how they like to work together. So physically speaking, you want to have a flexible classroom layout. And that's very key. It's incorporating various types of furniture arrangements to support both the individual and the group work. Psychologically speaking, teachers should use a classroom management techniques that support that safe and supportive learning environment. Because again, even though students cannot actually, they may not be able to say, oh, you're judging me, they feel it because we're grading them. So we are judging them, so they do feel very vulnerable. They don't want to be embarrassed if they offer an answer that's incorrect. So create quiet spaces, collaborative planning space, independent workspace, ability grouping. Next slide, please. Now, the key thing with managing differentiation is to decide what you want to teach, what content, what standards, what goals. The mistake, the struggle that I have seen, in my time in and outside of the classroom is that when teachers want to implement differentiated instruction, they try to do too much at once. Rather than take one content, one standard, one goal, 1 month, I'm going to try this. The other thing is you need to pre-assess. You need to determine existing knowledge and environmental needs rather than just jumping straight into it. So having a reflective exercise, some, think, pair, and share. Find out where your students' abilities are, learning contracts, one-pagers. Then you can start designing and teaching. This is not something that you're going to devise, all in 1 month, all in 1 weekend, all in 1 semester. It's something that it should be, you're implementing something new each month as you go through. And then you want to reflect and redesign the lessons based upon students' needs. You're not going to have everything done exactly right the first time. So research does show that differentiated instruction is very effective for high ability students as well as students with mild to severe disabilities. Students appear to be more engaged in learning because they feel like they're having fun. They're not just sitting and listening. They're actually manipulating, and they see what is happening with the knowledge. They see that process of where it's going. So it does take time, to create it. So, my advice would be, start small and lay a foundation, use some examples from reality, offer relevant practice, and continue going on and listen to the students. Listen to what they say about things, because whatever they say, their comments, that's the clue as to what your next step is or what you might, decide to implement next. So that is how I have implemented differentiated instruction. And again, I've laid out the slides so that you can look things up and get more information. Thank you. And oh yes, here are some helpful resources for you. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, and I'm excited to get to participate in this webinar, and I thank Mike and others who put it together. From my perspective today, I'm coming from 41 years as an educator. I spent 17 of those years teaching culinary arts. So next slide, please. And as I started, I realized it was very idealistic, not at all very practical. I had a whopping 3 credit hour course on how to work with students who had special needs. And I had a classroom full of students who needed some additional assistance that I felt woefully unprepared to give. And I'm very thankful for the number of people through the years who have helped me and given me ideas. I chose these pictures, everyone, because I think it really sums up what we're talking about today. On the left, you have to see a group of students with a teacher, all of them very different, look different, have different expressions, etc. And they're all faced with this question that they're going to have, and which of these crossroads am I going to take? So what kind of career, what's going to happen to me once I leave high school? And so my purpose today, next slide, please. My purpose today is to really make us think about how do these two worlds intersect. Often CTE and SPED. And in CTE, we have somebody that's a subject matter expert. They know all there is to know about welding. They may or may not have had pedagogy and how to work with students, but they know about their field. And so that's what we have on one side. And on the other, we have people who have very specialized pedagogical and practical knowledge. And so how do we help those two worlds intersect in a way that is productive for the students? Next slide, please. ACTE has done a tremendous amount of work developing a high quality CTE program of study, and hats off to ACTE and their work that they did here. And if you're not familiar with that, if you're new to that, I've given you the link. You can do a self-assessment online. In fact, I have students in class do that in my teacher ed courses, and shows you where you may need to work, or what area, what element you might need to enhance. Next slide, please. And so as I give you some practical examples, I prepared this slide to show you where UDL, and differentiated instruction really interfaces with high quality CTE programs of study. So you have that information. Next slide. I work with teachers who are coming to teaching as a second career. They're career switchers, are often in their mid to late 40s, and that's typically the population I work with. And of course, I know not all CTE teachers are that. Some CTE teachers chose it as their first career. But I've used this framework through the years to help explain what our expectations would be of high quality CTE and what that might look like as you roll that out into a classroom. And so we're fond of acronyms, but CCDM. And so we're going to look at each of those real quickly, and I'll give you some practical examples. Next slide. C for comfort. And I want you to think about these 4 letters in terms of the CTE teacher and the student, the CTE teacher and the special ed teacher, and the special ed teacher and the student. So all those different relationships that are happening simultaneously. So how comfortable you are with each other, how much you respect what role each of you have. Next slide. Then we have to think about providing a challenge. And one of the things that my students always enjoyed was when the Southern Living magazine came out for the Christmas edition, because I would challenge them to prepare one of the very elaborate dishes in that magazine for an upcoming event. And they all were, anxiously awaiting, when are we going to get to do this? But the piece that I did that I think really interfaced well with the special ed teachers was they would prepare it for if they were a student who received those services, they prepared it for that special ed teacher. And so there was that relationship built in. The next slide, please. And then the deep dive into it. So we want to have comfort, we want to have challenge, we want to have depth in our curriculum, and then the last one is motivation. And so we want to have motivation as well. Next slide. So I want to give you some practical examples. We were a team, and I learned early on that my success was not going to be because of my efforts, but my success as a CTE teacher was going to be when I worked with other professionals to help us all together be successful with the student. I could not provide everything they needed in my class. And so I learned early on that we were a team. And so we would learn to communicate, and today with email, it'd be much simpler than the ways in which we did it then. But I had a standing policy as a teacher, as a CTE teacher, that I did not allow more than 2 weeks to go by that I had not been in contact with the special ed teacher that worked with that student at their home school. I probably should have said as I started, we shared students. So I had them half a day, and then the other half a day they would be at their home school. I would go and spend time observing them in their home environment. And I was fortunate with the administrator who allowed me to do that. And so it's very different to see them in their home environment, in their home school. You'll see some other suggestions that I have under that bullet as well. Probably one of the things that they really looked forward to was one-on-one with Mrs. C. And at that time, my last name was Crawford. And so we did the normal interest surveys, learning styles, but I scheduled a one-on-one time with each student where we talked about what that told us and what kinds of things did they enjoy doing. And I'm giving you examples of 3 simple questions that I would ask them to kind of get deeper than just, oh, this is how I learn, or this is what I'm interested in. Next slide, please. I made home visits. That was part of my background, being trained as a family and consumer sciences instructor. We were asked to do that, and so I made home visits. I tried to show interest in what they were interested in. I attended a lot of high school football games, a lot of music contests, a lot of choirs, practices and choir concerts, and giving them choices when it was appropriate. If there were times that we could have a choice about what we did first, then I allowed them to make those choices, and 3 different students could choose 3 different things they wanted to do. And so I individualized instruction one-on-one with each student. Next slide, please. I used, as I've already mentioned, individualized. I used what are called learning activity packages. I used a lot of common discussion, information sharing times. A couple of things I wanted to share with you today is a policy I had about having students sign your work. And now, how can you sign a chocolate chip cookie? Really can't do that unless you use frosting or something. But when they would place an item out in our cafeteria, we ran the cafeteria for the school. And so when they would put it out and it was going to be sold during the lunch hour break, I had little cards that they would fix and they would put up with their items so that their name was on it. And so to develop pride in what they were doing. Very quickly, I'll tell a quick story. I had a student one time come in and he was holding by the corner an envelope that said the district attorney's office. And he told me he'd gotten it in the mail and so forth, but he was really concerned about opening it because the last time he heard from the district attorney, it was not good news. And so he was concerned about opening it. We went ahead and opened it, and it was a thank you note. from one of our district attorneys in the area who had been at an event, and this student had prepared cookies for that event. And it was one of my students that had an IEP, and he was so thrilled with that letter. And I'm grateful even today to that busy professional for taking time to do that and send that to him. It meant a great deal to him. And talking to them about what foods they eat. And Navajo tacos were very popular in our part of the world, had a number of Native American Indian tribes. And so can you show me how to make that? I don't know how. Can you show me? Next slide, please. Math was the biggest challenge, despite high school counselor who told me she, you really didn't have to know math to teach culinary or to work in culinary. She couldn't understand why I thought that was important. But in talking with her, I found out she didn't do any cooking. Her husband did the cooking, so that explains why she didn't think math was important. But it was by and far my biggest challenge. I went and got elementary education math books. I kind of retaught myself how to teach certain concepts. We used a lot of visuals, a lot of display boards, pattern cutting boards that I fixed that had actual measuring cups, actual cups. All of my students could relate to pizza, and so we would use it, the pie idea, dividing up in fractions, etc. One of the ideas that I did that at first I thought they might not accept or think a little bit foolish were cookie sheets and what we call fuzzy wuzzies. I took pom-poms, all different colors. I put small magnets on the back, and I taught them how to use those to do math. And I know today we would have math manipulatives. I'm sure that would be far more sophisticated than what we were using. But what I want you to notice, everyone, is that all students have those, regardless of whether they had an IEP, they didn't have an IEP, they had a 504, whatever the case, we all had one, including me. And so I used it as a way to help them understand that all of us have areas where we need extra help, and there's nothing wrong with asking for that help. Next slide, please. Graphic organizers have already been mentioned this afternoon. I use those heavily. I would take recipes, processes, things that needed to be done, and divide them up into various steps. One young man who was probably one of the lowest in terms of test scores that I ever worked with, he really enjoyed cleaning the dining room after lunch. I made him a storyboard of pictures that were on big pieces of colored paper, had them laminated, fixed them on an O-ring where he could take himself through those various steps. And he was most excited the day when he came to me and he said, Mrs. C, I think I can do it without the pictures. And that really came home to me that I don't care what your abilities are or what things you might struggle with. We all want to do good work. Next slide, please. A lot of issues at times with the emotions. I had a policy, I say policy, that makes it sound real formal, but practice is probably a better word. I had a practice where at any time you could come to me, simply tap me on the shoulder and give me the timeout sign. And that meant you needed some time out, that your emotions were getting the best of you. We had a walk-in freezer, which certainly you could walk in and you would definitely cool off pretty quickly. And it wasn't anything that I ever had a student abuse, but I helped them to learn that all of us have times at which our emotions are too high. We need to kind of regroup. And so that I was trying to teach them how to handle that. We would often plan a critical or tough conversation they might be going to be having with the parent or someone else. And then I give you a number of different other ideas there that you can read. The highway signs, very simple. Red, I need to stop. This is too much right now. Yellow was, can you slow down a little bit? And green is, I am with you, let's keep moving. And I had those made at their desk, and as we were going through lecture, they could hold those up and give me a visual cue if they were with me or not. Next slide, please. And I used a very similar, very simple sheet, like this, where periodically, not every day, but periodically we would talk about how I was feeling. But I want you to notice particularly where you have the 4 choices. It's more than just how am I feeling, it's what can I do or what works best for me, helping them get in tune with themselves and being able to manage that. The young man that I mentioned earlier about cleaning the dining room, he went on to work at a local business with an individual who was very kind and worked with him to continue to develop his skills. But he ended up being very successful in his life because he felt like he could do something and he had the ability to move forward. And so the next slide, if you will, as I'm finishing up, is that the paradox that I really think faces education is human beings are both similar and different. We are all similar in some of our needs, but we're also different. And I appreciate your time and thank you.
Thank you to all of our panelists today. We greatly appreciate the support. You provide us a lot of things to think about and things we could take away and use. At this time, we're moving into our Q&A session. As we mentioned earlier, please, if you have any questions or comments, type them into the question and answer box so that we can respond. Currently, there's none in there, so.
What I want to do, if it's okay, is just jump
Sure.
in and ask George Van Horn. Dr. Van Horn, as you implemented UDL as part of your school district's philosophy, did you see resistance, or were there pockets of, or groups of teachers that were maybe more interested and more adept to doing that? And then how did you interface those skill sets with your career and technical education teachers?
Yes. Do I need to say anything else? We had teachers who were really excited, teachers who were sitting on the fence, and teachers who, as I said earlier, felt if they kept their head down, this too shall pass. A couple things that helped us is we did identify some teachers who really were excited about the opportunity, and began to work with them and sort of created, I don't want to say models because that's not right, but folks who really got it, and we could begin to have teachers talk to teachers about what they were doing and about looking at the learning environment. So that's how we kind of started. It was really, when we provided trainings, it was really teachers training teachers, having conversations with teachers. And our C4, which is our career, it's not a center, but where our career and CTE courses are provided, they were a part of the trainings and conversations from the beginning. And actually, the prior director, Marilyn Metzler, and the current director, Jean Heck, both were big supporters of Universal Design for Learning. So they really got on board with the conversation and really engaged their teachers. And those teachers were part of the general conversation. We also connected with this organization. It's called Columbus Education Coalition, and it's not an educators group. It's actually a community-wide, really business-driven group that's focused on education. And they were looking at advanced manufacturing as a need for our area. We had several, excuse me, companies that were looking for employees. So we started having conversations with them about Universal Design for Learning. So we were able to sort of, as we grew in our utilization of the framework in the school, we also started to reach out to community organizations and business organizations, our local universities, Ivy Tech and IEPC, we had conversations with. Obviously a big employer in our community, Cummins, we had conversations with. So we didn't just sort of keep it to ourselves, if you will. And when you have employers beginning that conversation and community members, that helps support it. Now, again, we're not like massively integrated into all the businesses in town. I don't want to mislead you, but we do have a business advisory that's involved in the conversation, and our C4 group is involved in that.
Good, thank you. Mary Jo, a follow-up for you. As you work with CTE instructors, do you feel that the environment in career and technical education really kind of naturally lends itself to UDL and differentiated instruction approaches, so that CTE teachers kind of come to that with their instructional delivery maybe more readily than others?
Oh, absolutely, Mike, absolutely. And it's often that I'll have, we'll be talking in class and going through different strategies, and teachers will be saying, yes, I've tried that, or yes, I do that with my career tech program. And then we'll get to the end of the discussion and I will say, there's actually a name for that, and that's called UDL, or differentiated instruction. And they'll say, oh, I didn't know there was a name for it. I just naturally did that. And so because not every student in any CTE program would be headed toward the same job, we are diversified already to begin with. So yes, Mike, I think it really does lend itself very naturally. And it's really two worlds that I hope will continue to intersect, and even more than intersect, begin to integrate with each other, because I think both groups have a tremendous amount to bring to the student.
I think the Perkins V legislation, the new Perkins
Yes.
Law 2018, really provides an opportunity to meet the needs of students in special populations, but specifically the Perkins legislation speaks to students with disabilities and providing instructional supports and making sure that we do have equity and access issues that are those things that Tracy talked about earlier.
Right. And often with our setting and sharing students, they could be successful with us in a program, in a CTE program, that they might not be as successful at their home school, because there's a new group of students who had no experience with each other, and it really kind of gave them a fresh start too, Mike, and I think that's another piece.
Good, thanks. Tracy, just quickly, I know you do training and work with school communities across the country. Do you have any insight for our audience in relationship to universal design for learning and its intersect between special ed and career and technical educators?
Completely. We're very excited now at CAST to be starting some work in the workforce education area. And a lot of people have misunderstood that, as George mentioned, that a universal design for learning is a special education initiative, but it's not. When you think about our principles and what it is that we're doing, it's universal design for learning for all. And what we want to do is for those students in those margins, that 7 and 10 pin, both of the students that are challenged and those students who are not challenging enough, we really want to make sure those educational opportunities are there. And the connection to the workforce environment, or the CTE as well, is really high and strong. We're just beginning some research there, and very excited about some of the career explorations that we're helping to develop based on the framework of universal design for learning.
So I think this is Dawn. I think you kind of answered it. There's a question in the question and answer about suggestions for CTE teachers who have students for full days versus half days, because Mary Jo said she worked with students for half days. And I think, Tracy, you mentioned, the universal design for learning. Those strategies, or that framework, or that way of thinking, would help identify what barriers are in place and what barriers you can knock down to better support students throughout the day, regardless of how long that you might be working with them. Do y'all have some other examples that you would like to share?
Yes, Dawn, I'll add to that, because I actually had some students all day at times, and it is more challenging, obviously, for a full day than it is for just a morning or just an afternoon. And that's really where I relied a lot on my academic center to help me provide supplemental instruction. And for those students, when appropriate, like if they learned a technique in the morning, they got to demonstrate it to the afternoon class, if that was possible. And so there are some ways to do that, but I will absolutely admit straight up, it's more difficult because it's a longer stretch of time. I actually had students who needed to go and kind of have a rest time where they were just, seated in a comfortable chair and just kind of resting for a while. And so it does present challenges. But again, if you'll pull on your team, draw your team in, work with your team, I think you can better manage that. And I would really break up the day as much as you can.
Well, and I'm assuming we probably have some special educators on the phone. They're saying, welcome to my world, because they're working with students all day long.
Yes.
What the
Absolutely.
point I heard you make that's really important for both career technical education and special education is the need for collaboration. In order
Absolutely.
to best support our students, we have to work together and communicate with each other on what's working and what's not in order to best support students in school. So I appreciate that comment.
And
If
Dawn,
I
I
could
found
just-
that, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Tracy. Go ahead.
I'm so sorry. If I could just chime in here, though, I really wanted to add on to what Mary Jo was saying and what you were saying as well. And that is that in the same way that it's challenging to have a student for an entire day, it can be challenging for the student to have two different settings if we're not consistent in how we coordinate and set expectations and organize those settings, identify the barriers and work to break those barriers down in similar ways for those two different situations. So it's really a two-way street.
Yeah, that is very important. Good comment.
We also had a policy practice at the end of the year where, again, with the very understanding administrator who allowed me to take that student back to their home school, and they would prepare some sort of dish or some kind of snack or something to share with their teacher. And so it was really a collaborative effort, and I found the years when I worked harder at that collaboration were the years that the students were more successful.
So maybe Claudia or Mary Jo, or maybe even Tracy too, or George, have y'all had experience teaching collaboratively with CTE, special ed together, providing some of the supports through differentiated instruction as Claudia talked about, that you could expand on maybe?
Yes, I have. So I've worked with several, when I used to work at the State Agency of Career Tech, I worked with several departments, TNI and culinary arts, and so helped them to devise, for example, some kind of code key that the students were using already at the high school feeder schools, so that way there's a similarity. So we work collaboratively that way. I would work with the schools, find out how they were using differentiated instruction in their special education classrooms, and then work with the tech centers to tell them this is how they're doing it, and these are some ideas for you with your automotive curriculum or your culinary or cosmetology or whatever curriculum it may be.
Perfect.
And so that's how I did it.
That is also an important point. The strategies that we know work for academics also works for career technical education. And so sometimes we may not be using the same language to describe those strategies, but we're essentially doing similar or the same strategies. And so again, going back to the need to collaborate and communicate with each other to best support students. Thank you for sharing.
I can share really briefly an example that I've been working with recently, an organization called Youth Build USA, in which students that have dropped out of high school and are not employed have gone to Youth Build USA to work on that high school equivalency of some sort, as well as begin working and learning in the trades. And the connection of those two components of their work was very slim. In other words, when they were in the classroom working on their high school diploma type of work, that was very academically oriented and very traditional in the educational environment. And when they went into the trades work, they were actually, really doing a lot more of that hands-on kind of work, very working toward a goal of completion of creating something, whether it be in the culinary arts or in nursing or in construction. And the connection of the needs and what they were learning in the classroom environment and what they were doing in their trades work wasn't made. And so we've been working to help those two groups communicate and to work on the sameness of those. The reason that they need to learn the math in the academic setting is because in nearly every one of those careers, there's some level of math that's necessary. So helping to make that connection and the need and the use of those skills that they're learning.
It just goes back to point to the fact that when you think about teaching and learning, you have student variables, and Claudia talked about this, i.e. readiness and interest, and then you have teaching variables, which is content and method and approach to teaching, and how important it is that we understand that to create a positive environment, but we also share the skill sets amongst special educators and CTE instructors as well, and that's kind of the thrust of this conversation. Mary Jo, didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's fine. In my work now, working with preparing CTE teachers, when they prepare instructional materials for me for an assignment now, I want to know obviously what standards they're teaching to in terms of their trade, but I also require them to mark where they're teaching math and where they're teaching English and in communication skills, etc. And trying to just make them more aware that although they may not feel like they're teaching math, they're teaching math, and trying to help us pull those two pieces together. And just the sheer fact of having them note that on their assignments has caused many of them to really think about that more, I think.
I just think a critical point that Dawn made, and I think we've all reiterated this throughout the presentation, is that the importance of career and technical ed instructors working with special educators who have shared students, so that we build common opportunities and common language and common approaches to really create universal design for learning across the settings that are there for the students that we serve.
Absolutely. It's absolutely critical.
So we're coming to a close. I wanted to remind, thank you everybody for all the panel members for attending and providing us some exceptional content today, and Dr. Harvey for moderating for us. I want to remind everybody that there is a link to the evaluation in the chat box. If you could please take a few minutes to go to the link and provide us some feedback and guidance to help support improving these webinars in the future. There's also a question about where we can get a copy of the slides or resources. There's also a link in the chat box where those are located, but they are on the NTACT website, which is transitionta.org, and they will also be on ACTE's website at the end of this session. The webinar was recorded. It will be posted after the fact, and closed caption will be available within the next 10 days or so. Just a reminder, our next webinar is November 21st, 2019, and it's all about classroom management and behavioral supports, motivation and reflective teaching. I have one last question in the answer box, and we have 2 minutes. So team, you want to take it really quick?
Yes.
Okay. Says we have ESE teachers that assist with working with students with disabilities, which I'm assuming is teaching assistants, maybe? I don't know. Nina, if you can unmute yourself and clarify if you're available. Oh no, actual special ed teachers working alongside at your school with the CTE, so they're doing collaborative teaching.
Great.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, that's a really great experience. I've been fortunate to be in that role as well, and probably one of the most amazing experiences I've had in my lifetime is to teach alongside a career technical education teacher. All right, so we got 1 more minute to go. I don't see any other questions in the chat box or the Q&A at the moment. Again, I want to thank the panel members and Mike. Mike, do you have a few last words you'd like to say?
I'd also like to thank the panel members. I think all of you did a super job. The content, the resources, the information you shared was hugely valuable for this particular webinar. And I want to thank the audience. I think it's critically important that you learn and take the message and the information and move forward with building that bridge so that we can provide supports and services for students with disabilities in career and technical education programs. Appreciate everybody's effort this afternoon.
Thank you.
All right, well, y'all have a wonderful day, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.